right, everyone. Let's continue onwards. Let me just make one housekeeping note. Just fiddling with Zoom there. I am recording these classes. None of you are on the record. It's all facing forward. The reason I'm recording them is just as a backup for those of you, if any of you already have one or two, for medical reasons, need to miss class. It has to be done through TCU, okay? Or if it's a formal TCU excused absence, whether you're in athletics and you're on a trip or whatever the case may be. I will have the material on a one-on-one link available if you need to take a look at a lecture later on, right? So I'm not putting the material out there for public viewing, because then, well, for obvious reasons, attendance starts dropping off, and then it's you and me at the end of the semester, right? Because everyone else wants to watch it online. So I think that'll just stave off any problems down the line. I'm totally aware that things happen. I hope you don't feel unwell or take ill, but there's a reality that a lot of people are going to be experiencing that. I hope not, but reality is. So that's just FYI. So if you do have an excused absence, if I get something through the university and you need access to the lecture, just let me know, and I'll send you a link. Okay. All good. All right. So let's keep going. We're a little behind, but that's absolutely fine because I've actually got an overflow lecture built in, so it should be good. So this morning, I want to cover three topics. One is just finish off the material. If you look at the slides on the Anthropocene and the history, this is the history part this morning. And as you can see from the title here, very brief, right? This is truly a 80,000 blessing foot look at environmentalism, I suppose through an American lens, for sure. That's really all we have time for. So we'll do that for about 15 minutes. That's the first topic I want to look at. The second one will be environmental ethics. And I want to introduce you to a very important concept that relates to value of ecosystems. And then if we have time, and I don't need to rush through it, but if we have time, we'll talk about science. Ugly word, right? We're all getting a natural science credit for this class. I want to focus on that. The lights seem very bright, but I suppose that's okay. Those screens pretty good from the back. You okay? All right, great. Okay, now I expect you to know one person on this slide, maybe both, but certainly one. So who we got out here? Why are we starting this very brief journey with these two? On the right, Teddy Roosevelt, right? So President Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States on the right. And on the left is actually a really important person in the history of environmentalism, and his name is Gifford Pinchot, P-I-N-C-H-O-T. Why did we start here? Well, so President Roosevelt became the youngest president at the age of 42, right? Once William McKinley was assassinated. And the point of this morning is not to look at his presidential legacy, but to look at what many people consider his greatest contribution as part of that presidential legacy, which is his contribution to conservation, right? His conservation ethic. And the things that he did, largely through executive orders, whether you agree with that or not, is not part of the discussion, in establishing many, over 100 protected forest reserves in the United States. The guy on the left, Gifford Pinchot, was born into a wealthy family, went to Yale University, became a forester, became one of the early directors of the Division of Forestry. It wasn't at that point the U.S. Forest Service. It became, in the late 1890s, the director of the Division of Forestry. He later became governor of Pennsylvania, but that was much later in 1920. Anyway, they knew each other, and Pinchot actually worked in the White House. They influenced each other very much on their view of the environment and conservation. Gifford Pinchot then helped establish the U.S. Forest Service in 1906, I believe it was, right? and he became the first director of the U.S. Forest Service. And the idea here, everybody, is that both Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt believed very strongly in conservation, right? In fact, those first few letters of their party, right, the Conservative Party, was built around this notion of to conserve the environment, right? And that's very different to someone I'm going to introduce you to in just a bit. Very different to this idea of preservation, right? This is conservation, and conservation meaning that we should conserve our resources, but we should use them, right? This wasn't a question of hands off of any of our ecosystems, that we should use them wisely for human beings here and now, right? And that is very much the ethic of the US Forest Service. I'm delusional if I can think I can see without these things. All right. So the ethic of the US Forest Service, the art of producing from the forest whatever it can yield for the service of man, right? So yes, setting aside forest reserves, but being able to use those reserves for wood, right, lumber, whatever, okay, to kind of give us a foundation for a stronger economic system, but to be able to replenish those as well. And so this led to what was known as and has become widely known as utilitarian or pragmatic conservation, right? Utilitarian, pragmatic resource conservation. The use of resources, not the complete waste of resources, but the use of resources for the here and now. This is just a quote of what I think sort of sums up utilitarian conservation. Resources should be used for the greater good, for the greatest number, for the longest time, right? Does that make sense? Okay, that was President Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot and many people working in the White House in the early 1900s. Roosevelt's presidency was 1901 to 1909, right? And if you just want a visual picture of the impact of President Roosevelt on the environment, this is the extent of our forest reserves at the end of the Cleveland administration in 1897. McKinley was elected president in 1897, then of course was assassinated a couple of years later when Roosevelt took over. So there's the extent of forest reserves in 1897 in the United States. This is what they look like at the end, towards the end of the Roosevelt administration. Over 100 reserves put into the US Forest Service, over 1 million acres, right? Claiming land and putting it under the federal government. It was pretty controversial, right, in many parts, this sort of appropriation of land to put under the federal government. But that really, I think, is probably President Roosevelt's largest legacy, at least from an environmental perspective, right? So that period, the late 1890s, 1900, that first decade, the end of the Roosevelt administration, all really built around this idea of pragmatic utilitarian resource conservation. And then there's this guy on the right-hand side of this photograph, okay? Now, Roosevelt ends up being in this picture as well. So this is John Muir on the right, born in 1838 in Dunbar in Scotland, died in 1914. Anybody heard of John Muir? Probably have, yeah, right? So John Muir, as you can see here, was one of the founders and the first president of the Sierra Club. So Muir was an extraordinary individual, came from a very religious family. Himself was a really religious man, and at the age of 11, he moved from the United States. Incidentally, everybody, this little bit is in that PDF that I put online under history, right? So Muir moves to the United States at the age of 11 to Wisconsin. Does his schooling there, goes to the University of Wisconsin, and really kind of is this hardcore naturalist, environmentalist, but deeply rooted in religion, right, in spirituality, and fundamentally believed that the wonder of nature was put there by a supreme power, was put there by God, okay? So Muir travels around the United States. If you're really interested in this guy, really worth looking up. He writes some incredible stuff. He does this 1,000-mile walk from Kentucky to the Gulf. He just packs up his backpack one day and he's like, I think I'm going to walk down Florida. And so he does, right? And he writes amazing writing, beautiful pieces of literature. So Muir, I'll explain this little quote in just a second. So Muir marches around the eastern part of the United States. In 1868, he moves out to California and falls in love with Yosemite, right? Sees Yosemite for the first time, but he's also quite shocked that there are sheep grazing in Yosemite and there's lots of human impact, agriculture and so on. And he really sees this as, you know, a temple that needs to be preserved, not conserved, but preserved. Muir's ethic was one of preservation. Hands off, guys, right? We need to preserve nature for many, many reasons. Above all else, that everything in the landscape has a right to exist in and of itself, right? This notion of preservation. And President Roosevelt's really taken with this guy's writings. And he sends Muir a note and says, you know what, I want to come out to Yosemite and visit with you. And he says in that note, I don't want anyone with me but you, and I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days and just be out in the open with you, right? And John Muir is like, cool. President Roosevelt comes out. And at that point, Roosevelt was aware that Muir was, you know, very anti grazing. He was very, they wanted a dam, the Hetch Hetchy Valley. That's another great book if you're ever interested in that. And this was an opportunity for Muir to get with the president and say, you know what, Yosemite needs to become a national park. We need to put Yosemite, we'll take it out of the control of the state of California and put it under the control of the federal government, right? Because he was really concerned that this incredible landscape was going to be degraded. There's so much stuff online. There's a great video, there's a great book called Camping Trip That Changed America. This was an extremely important meeting between President Roosevelt and John Muir. So Muir's approach, his philosophy, and the Sierra Club, incidentally, was just a group of people who were hikers. They wanted to move around the Sierra and hike. It was an alpine hiking club. But Muir fundamentally believed, right, that nature's object in making animals and plants might possibly be, first of all, the happiness of each of them. Not their value in terms of a commodity, not their use in terms of a utilitarian use, right? But let it be, right? He saw landscapes as spiritually uplifting, right? And many people still do, right? I don't know if you are in their shoes. I personally, I don't get my gas tank filled up any more than when I go back to South Africa and I'm sitting out in the bush and the sun's setting and I see the African land. That's what fills my gas tank, right? You may be very different or have a different place. But Muir's approach to the world was what is now viewed as moral or aesthetic nature preservation, right? And that philosophy leads to the foundation of the national park system, right? So the national park system and the U.S. Forest Service are in many ways, complementary in a sense, right? One is preserving landscapes for their own good, right? You can't go into a national park and start cutting down trees and selling them, even if you're going to replant them. The Forest Service, you can. So that's the late 1890s, 1910, 1920s. And those two approaches sort of really, I think, capture the spirit of environmentalism, if that makes sense, right? Well, then we go through the 1930s, the Great Depression, 1940s, World War II. We've talked about coming out of World War II and the Great Acceleration. And I think it's probably fair to say that the next big environmental milestone is the publication of this book. Anybody heard of this? Anybody read Silent Spring, right? You may have. Yeah, so this book is extraordinarily important. This is Rachel Carson, just a wonderful scientist, an ecologist. And Rachel Carson publishes in 1963, she publishes Silent Spring, which is an immense environmental publication focusing on and kind of documenting the significance of pollution in the environment, specifically pesticides, and how fertilizers and chronic over-fertilization of crops and those pesticides begin to concentrate and build up and magnify through ecosystems. Things like DDTs, right, and toxins in the environment. It really is a scientific masterpiece. The 1960s, of course, is this decade of activism, right? In the 1960s, what else is going on in the 1960s? Well, it's the Vietnam War, there's flower power, Woodstock, hippies, and so on. And what actually ends up happening is that all sort of leads to the first Earth Day in April of 1970. So the 1960s is this extraordinary decade. Some people refer to it as the decade of awakening, right? People really start sort of waking up to human impact on the environment, right? And the early 1970s in the United States, remember, this is just a very brief look at the US in the early 1970s, we start seeing some extremely important bits of legislation coming out: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, right? The Endangered Species Act. Congress starts acting and passing this legislation because what they've noticed is for 2 decades, as people have moved through this great acceleration and consumption and production and so on, that leaves sort of quite a stain on the environment. And then I think, just to end this very, very brief look, I think we cannot really underestimate the importance of the space program and all that entails, being able to look back at this marvelous blue ball sitting out there in space, right? The launch of satellites, the early space program, certainly 1969, human beings put their foot on the moon. They look back, 1969, that famous image. This is not that shot. I should actually put it up there, right? That moon shot where they're looking over the moon and they're seeing this incredible thing on which we all live, right? Which suddenly, you don't think about maybe 8 billion people and all the problems that are captured on this, what looks like immensely fragile planet with a very thin envelope of gas sitting around it, right? But our ability to monitor the planet from space and to be able to make high resolution maps, satellite mapping, infrared mapping, right? Now you and I just take it for granted. If you want to go look at anything, you probably just put in Google Earth, boom, and you can go right into the Amazon and get high resolution images of the Amazon. But that really started in the 1960s and the 1970s. So I suppose this kind of, I don't know, global environmentalism, being able to look at the planet as a whole and our actions and how those actions might impact other parts of the world. And that is my 15 or 16-minute view of where we've come from 1890 to today. Chronically underrepresented. Okay, thoughts, comments, questions on that, everybody? I wanted to just give you that quick overview, if that makes sense. Don't reach Silent Springs. Not easy. It'll take you quite a while, but it's pretty remarkable work. Okay, all right. So that's a brief history of environmentalism. So there it is. So the next 2 things then that I want to cover are environmental ethics, and then if we have time this morning, the scientific method. Again, I don't feel any need to rush through this, but let's talk about environmental ethics for a little bit. Ethics, and then we'll get to science. So this is another one, as you know, of my favorite places and one of my favorite things to do. Costa Rica, and you go on to these walks. Has anybody done any of these suspensions in Costa Rica? Yeah, pretty amazing, right? And whenever I do this, I'm always, cognizant not just of the species diversity that's surrounding me, but also watching students and how they respond to this, right? This does not look like downtown Fort Worth, obviously. This gives you a completely different feel, okay? And so the question, I'm going to try, if I remember, to kind of just throw out a thought-provoking question at the start of each class, is, and I've alluded to this before last week, how do we achieve a balance between human values and interests and our obligations and responsibilities to nature? If you personally believe that we have responsibilities and obligations to nature, right? So that's one of the great challenges, I think, not just in a course like this, but that's one of the great challenges as we go about our day-to-day business, right? Especially once we graduate and go out into that big bad world. How do we balance human values and interests relative to our obligations? It's not an easy thing. And I think that begins to get us into this field of environmental ethics. Now, I don't want to turn this into a philosophy course. And if you're interested in environmental ethics, there's a fantastic program at UNT just up the road, actually one of the best in the United States. They have a whole environmental philosophy and environmental ethics program. So this notion of human values and the natural world, we spent a long time, I think, as a species, human beings, building fences to keep animals out, right? Now we're building fences to keep them in, because there are just so many of us, urbanization, expansion, the development of agriculture, and so on. And even when I go back to the Eastern Cape of South Africa, yeah, these game reserves, some of which are fairly small at something like 10 to 20,000 acres, some of which are really large at 500,000 acres, they're still fenced, right? We have these fences and we keep all these animals in and we bring people in and they have these wonderful safari experiences. And then beyond those fences is true human impact, whether it's deforestation or commercial agriculture or whatever the case may be, right? So we are managing already a very, very fragmented world, fragmented landscape. Okay, that's just a fact. So now we start getting into some difficult questions, I think. Okay. What should we protect when it comes to conserving wildlife? Right? These creatures, I know I should say rhinos are my favorite, but if I'm really honest, these are it. Right? I don't know if anybody's been close to an elephant, right? I don't mean riding one, I mean just in the natural. These creatures are absolutely extraordinary. In June, we did a coloring procedure on an elephant, a big matriarch. She had to have her color changed. And I can't begin to explain what that's like when you get up close and got the tranquilizer and she's settled, to actually put your nose into the trunk of an elephant, okay, and feel that breath whilst people were working on her. It's just mind blowing, right? So we tend to, I do perhaps, tend to sort of gravitate towards these glamorous megafauna. Okay? Are these the only things we should be protecting? Probably not, right? Certainly these are the ones that it's, I don't know, easiest to raise money for. People want to protect elephants and rhinos and lions and tigers and pandas and so on. But the field of wildlife conservation and the conservation of nature is complicated, right? There are always competing values, right? Each one of us, as I mentioned last week when we first got together, we all come into this classroom with a worldview, right? And I'm not here to change your worldview. It's just to acknowledge and embrace this is my worldview. But we all have different values, and we all have different prioritizations, for sure. Okay, and that creates a lot of conflict and ethical dilemmas on what should we be preserving, how should we be preserving, where should we be directing our money? Because as I think I mentioned last week, the depressing news is there's not enough money to go around to save all of it. All right, someone is going to have to make the decisions of what is worth saving and what is not worth saving. And some people are like, how can you do that? How can you decide that something is not worth saving? Right? Does that make sense? So there is a complex, it's a very complex layered thing, nature conservation of wildlife. Now, what I like to try and do in this class in particular is not forget that this notion of ethics is very much part of what we do here at TCU. Okay? I don't know for the veterans of you out here who are in sort of, juniors, seniors, and moving towards the end of your academic careers at TCU, how much your classes have focused on that, right? But if we look at the mission statement of TCU, this is the mission statement of TCU. So if you're not familiar with it as a first-year student, this is what it is. And the colors and the underlines are mine. But we are a community dedicated to learning. TCU educates individuals to think and act as ethical leaders and responsible citizens in the global community, right? That is the mission of TCU. And I remember when that came out because I was fortunate enough to be on the committee that developed this mission statement back in the very early 2000s, okay? And if you want to watch faculty spend 6 months in a room going round and round and round, put them in a room and say, develop a mission statement for the university, right? Everybody comes at it from a different angle. But eventually over time, lots and lots of coffee, I think, we got down to something that the chancellor at the time wanted to put on a mug that we could all buy into, right? That we could all sort of focus on and say, yeah, this is not the only thing we do here, but this is our mission. So to think, it's a good thing, right? And act as ethical leaders. Ethics. Now, whose ethics? Right? We all have different, perhaps, ethical values. But nonetheless, we are here to instill ethical leadership, responsible citizenship, global community. When this came out, right, and I certainly was one of the people that was nudging this, I thought this was written for my department, environmental science. I mean, if you go out and you're interacting with the world and you're voting with your wallet every time you go to the grocery store and so on, there's something there about responsible citizenship, right? In a global community here in Fort Worth and around the world. Okay, so let's talk about environmental ethics then. How do we decide what constitutes an informed and responsible decision when it comes to the planet, right? Here's an example. Oh, let me just get this one out there as well. So when we talk about ethical leadership and responsible citizens, as I said, there is a whole sub-branch of the field, the discipline of philosophy, that is environmental ethics, right? So environmental ethics is the discipline in philosophy that studies the moral relationships of human beings to, and also the value and moral status of the environment and its non-human contents. I know that's kind of wordy, but there's some interesting things in there. If you just take it from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, okay? The moral relationships of human beings, and then the big one for me is the value and status of the environment. That word value is something I'm going to touch on in a bit more detail in a second, right? The different types of value. So that's what we're looking at when we look at environmental ethics. I know this is probably getting a bit sort of, I don't know, philosophical and lofty, but I think it's an important baseline to have before we launch into things like population and climate change and biodiversity. When we get to deforestation and biodiversity, I want you to be thinking, what was the value of that ecosystem? What is the value of this particular species, right? So you look at an image like this. This is an open pit mine in Australia. I don't know about you, but I don't find this a particularly uplifting landscape. I don't think John Muir would suggest that this is a spiritually defining landscape. But put yourselves in the position of the CEO of this mining company. Okay, you're going in there, you're mining out the material. A couple of questions: does this company have a moral obligation to restore this landscape once it's mined? Do you think they do? Does the company have an obligation to go in there once they've got all the lead, zinc, and whatever out and restore that landscape? Or can they just leave it and walk away? If you're the CEO of the company, because if you're going to go in there and restore it, that's going to cost you money, right? So that's one question. And what is the value of a human restored environment compared to its natural one? So, for example, if you're the chief executive of a coal company here in the United States and you're mining coal in West Virginia, and as you'll see a little later on in the next couple of weeks, one of the techniques of getting coal is what they call mountaintop removal. Right? They go in and they blow away the mountain and they scrape the coal. According to the Coal and Reclamation Act of 1977, you have to put the mountain back. Like, seriously? How are you going to do that? You have to restore the landscape to a pre-mined condition. How many of these companies are going in there and putting the mountain back? They're not. Okay. So that's what I mean about these ethical moral dilemmas, okay, when it comes to the environment. And that term that as part of that definition that I just wanted to spend a little time on is this term value, right? The value of a particular landscape. All right. So here's where I want you to think, and I'd like some interaction. So this is Costa Rica again, and it's one of my favorite spots when we take students to Costa Rica. This is the Sarapiquí River, and then one of the afternoons we stop and we do a whitewater trip, and it's all very cool and it's fun, and we're going down the river and we're eating pineapple and watermelon, and then we stop, we have lunch. And I just want people, when we're on that trip, and I know it's a little harder when you're sitting in the lecture hall, but to look at this river, okay, and I asked this question. How does that river work, do you think? How would you answer that? What would you say in an exam if I said, here's a river, how much do you think that's worth? You may think that's a bizarre question. Yeah.
I guess I would say it's invaluable.
Ah, so we go the John Muir route immediately. I love it. It's invaluable, right? You can't put a price on it. Anybody want to counter argue that?
Well, I guess
Or support it?
going along with it, like a couple ecosystems.
Right. There's communities and ecosystems within that. Yeah, there are. Yeah, right at the back. Speak out loudly.
I think you would have to like look at it and take into account like where it is on the map, what it feeds into, what it contributes to, but like what lives there.
Okay, excellent. So there's a broader context here, especially rivers, right? That river isn't starting right over there. There's something upstream, there's communities upstream, there's land use, livelihoods, and then there's downstream. Good. So there's a broader integrated context to that. Okay. What else? Yeah.
So I guess a lot of people would look at it by like how much resources does it give us?
Oh, there you go. Excellent. So what resources do you see here? If you were in the money business, what would you be doing here?
Besides this, how they get like their fresh source of water,
Okay.
what grows by it. So I guess
There's things there, there's commodities in there that you could harvest, right? Good. Yeah, literally, you could go in there and you could start chopping down those trees. You could sell the lumber, right? And if there's particular species of trees, like the almendro tree, you could probably sell that at a very, very high price because it's a beautiful exotic hardwood, right? Anything else of value in there, you think? Yeah. Ooh, okay. So you could put a small hydroelectric station in there, right? Or you could just dam the whole thing and put a reasonable one. Okay. Ooh, now we're thinking. Yeah. So now there's different types of values coming out of this image. You could probably go in there, and if you were into patio stones, big business, you could go into this channel bar here, right? This one over here, and mine out all that gravel and turn it into beautiful patio stone. Big business there. In-channel gravel mining around the world is devastating systems. And there's also, by the way, a whole bunch of things going on here that this ecosystem, whether it's upstream or downstream or in this image, is providing free of charge. Thank you very much. Right? Those trees are providing oxygen. The soils there, if they're fairly untouched, are probably cycling nutrients, right? There's fish community. There's a whole bunch of things going on in this one little picture. Okay. So when it comes down to, so good. When it comes down to value then in the environment, there's two different types. Okay. That's what $1 million looks like. Apparently, according to this photograph that I took of Shutterstock. That's $1 million. Okay. Does that have any value? Well, yeah. I mean, it's worth $1 million, but it's only worth $1 million because of what it is, right? The fact that it's printed with this monetary value that you can then buy stuff with, right? This pile of cash has an instrumental value. Right? That's the one type of value I want you to think about. I'm going to try and weave this in throughout this course. Don't worry, it's not going to be a philosophy course, but I'm going to try and come back and touch upon this. There's instrumental value here, right? This cash is a means to an end. Okay? If you want an Aston Martin DB11, you'd probably take a quarter of that and you'd be able to buy an Aston Martin or whatever, right? There is an instrumental value to that that has a means to an end. And there's some of that instrumental value in that landscape that we've just touched upon, right? Then there's this, right? I think I showed this picture before. This is the Eastern Cape of South Africa. I took this picture late afternoon. We're looking out over the scrubby Africa. There's a rainbow there. None of this has been photoshopped, just taken with an iPhone. The value to me comes back to your comment right at the beginning, right? How do you put a price on this? This has an intrinsic value that isn't worth $100, $1 million, $1 billion. It's something more than. It's the ends itself. It's not a means to an ends. It's just an ends. Does that make sense? Right? So those are two values that I do think we have to acknowledge and think about when we're dealing with a subject like the environment, an environmental issue. Right? And different people put a different emphasis on these values. Some people are like, yeah, that's great. Touchy-feely. Right? Let's look at that landscape and see, can those speckworms, can we turn that from a game reserve into a particular type of vegetation called speckworm, S-P-E-K-B-O-O-M, that's not important, but it's a vegetation that is extremely good at sequestering carbon, for example. So we turn that into a carbon sink and we sell carbon credits, right? It goes beyond the intrinsic value. So, yeah, tricky question, right? Is it wrong to put a price on nature? There are many people, everyone, who would argue, and especially those in the field of ecological economics, they would argue that unless we do this, we won't know what's worth preserving, right? Unless we can put a price on nature. Okay? And I would argue that the utilitarian or pragmatic conservationists would probably go, yeah, okay, I buy that. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who may say, sorry, that's just asinine. Right? We cannot put a price on nature. And why should we even begin to put a price on nature? Because there's so much intrinsic spiritual value tied up that we can't do it. Well, according to one report, we can. And this is the Living Planet report. It's a really interesting one, comes out every couple of years. So this is the Living Planet report on biodiversity, with a whole bunch of really smart people, including economists, and they have valued the world's ecosystems at about $125 trillion. Is it really worth 125 trillion? In the late 1990s, there was a paper that came out, very controversial paper, that the authors tried to put a price on ecosystems, right? How much is the nutrient cycling that goes on in the Amazon really worth, right? What are the fishing grounds in the Philippines really worth? And they came up with a number that said $33 trillion, and everybody jumped on that bandwagon. The environment's worth 33 trillion. Yeah, is it 125? Is it 150 trillion? Is it less? We could go round and round and argue that, right, ad nauseum. The point is, I think there's a strong argument that unless we do this, we won't really know what we're losing, right? Here's another way of looking at it. This is also from the Living Planet report, the World Wildlife Fund. And what you're looking at here is something called the Living Planet Index, right? The Living Planet Index, which is again an economic way of looking at biodiversity. Now, this is specifically looking at species, right? And what this is showing is that, so one is, that's the kind of baseline. What this is suggesting is that because we are losing so many species, right, through human-driven extinction, which we'll talk about much later on in this course, that we are losing the value of our ecosystems, the resources, and what they can provide. Okay, and the estimate here is that we're down to, we've lost something like 70% of all of our species and everything that those species bring. Right? I don't want to get bogged down if it's 70% or 50% or 90%. The point is, there's a strong consensus here, I think, that we as a species are impacting the value of our ecosystems, right? And what they do and what they do. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, cool. So a little bit of the history of environmentalism, and a little bit of environmental ethics. Any thoughts, any questions? Okay. And finally, science. Science as a way of knowing. Yeah, we've got 10 minutes left. This is probably going to take a little longer. So I'm not going to stop here. Let me just introduce you to this, what we're going to talk about, and then we'll get to the scientific method on Wednesday. All right, so science as a way of knowing, right? How many of you here, and you can just be totally honest, how many of you here would consider yourselves not really good at science? We're a little nervous about that. Okay, cool. Yeah, I get that a lot, right? There's kind of this trepidation of take these 2 natural science credits and he's not really good at science. That's totally okay, right? My message to you is don't sweat it, because science is just simply a way of gaining knowledge. That's all it is. And yeah, personally, if I was in a calculus class, I'd probably be on a ventilator, right? My math skills are not great. That's just the way it is. Right? But science, the scientific method, is just simply a way of gaining knowledge. Now, we may think of, what does it mean to be scientific? You may think of this guy, okay? Albert Einstein, one of the great minds of the 20th century. Or this dude, I don't know, right? Some of you may or may not know who Bill Nye is, okay? Some people think that if you're walking around in a white lab coat, then you are a scientist. And if you're a scientist and you have a PhD, then you must be believed, okay? And I'm here to tell you that science and scientists are constrained by this method, right? But we don't operate in a vacuum. Okay? Science operates within a culture, okay? And it's not perfect, and that's what really frustrates me personally, is when science shows that something is not quite right. People say, well, you can't believe scientists. You just can't believe them. They're making all this stuff up, right? When science shows that something is incorrect, that just means that we need to find better science to either verify that or not. It's just simply an approach to the world, right? Yeah, I binge watched 5 episodes of this last night. I love this program. So this is Sheldon, obviously, right? And some people look at this and they think, yeah, that's how I see science. I see science as this mysterious, incomprehensible, don't want to do it, too many equations, things going on, right? It's not. Science is simply a systematic, precise, hopefully objective way of getting knowledge, of gaining knowledge. That's all it is, right? There's a very important word here, and that's biased or unbiased. I don't know how you feel, but certainly this is just my opinion, my perspective is that, lately, and maybe that's just built around vaccines, I don't know, but science seems to be sort of under the gun, okay? Scientists are ethically bound by this method to be unbiased. Doesn't mean to say you can't be forward, right? Doesn't mean to say that there aren't crooked scientists, but there's not some global conspiracy in trying to move the body of knowledge forward through an unbiased look. There is, and this is just my personal little plea to you, there is a lot of bad science out there, right? What we call junk science. And please, please, as you go through your academic careers and even well beyond it, okay, just take a moment to come back and check where the source is coming from. Who's actually putting this data out there? Where does the money flow? What money is behind this particular science, right? So junk science is faulty scientific data, right? And the media love it, right? The media will put a spin on anything, generally to back up their particular viewpoints or their particular bias. So just be aware of that. Okay, there's a lot of that going on. Doesn't mean to say science is bad, not at all. But there is some pretty bad science being done out there. So what is this method, right? Well, the method is so elegant and really quite simple. And I will say right up front, everybody, not everything is open to this type of inquiry. So here is an example, right? This actually happened to me in February during the big snowvid event, right? The big Texas freeze. The power goes out, okay, I fumble around on the nightstand, get the flashlight, and I click the flashlight and nothing happens, right? The dog's barking, nothing's going on, and I can't get my act together because the flashlight isn't working. So what can it be, right? Well, obviously, first thing that comes to mind is probably the batteries. Might be the bulb's broken, maybe the switch is faulty. So what I do is I fumble around, get the iPhone, try and find some batteries, put the batteries in, and the flashlight finally works, right? What I've just done, very simply, is apply the scientific method. Okay? That's the method that constrains us as to how we do our science, the scientific method, right? It's so elegant because all it involves is an observation, and the observation here is the flashlight doesn't work. Okay? And then you come up with an educated guess as to why that might be. The educated guess is, well, it's probably the batteries, right? Or maybe there are multiple guesses. Could be the batteries, the switch, or the bulb, right? So then you run this little experiment where you're changing out these variables one at a time. Well, I'll swap the batteries out. Yep, bingo, it worked. Or not. Does that make sense? Right? That's the scientific method. Okay, which looks a bit more formal in this diagram here. So the scientific method, again, not everything is open to this form of inquiry, but a lot is. Starts with making an observation. And that's how we start, to make an observation. Uh-oh, this isn't working. Something's up. And then we ask the question, and that question is the question that formulates our educated guess. And that's what a hypothesis is. A hypothesis is nothing more and nothing less than an educated guess, right? I think it's probably the batteries. My working hypothesis is that the batteries are the reason why the flashlight is not working. Does that make sense? That's what a hypothesis is. Then you run your experiment and you see what the data shows, and you change the batteries and the flashlight comes on, right? When the flashlight comes on, once you've changed the batteries, you can then accept your hypothesis. You haven't proved anything. All you can do at that point is say that my experiment verifies my hypothesis. It supports my hypothesis that batteries are the variable at fault. If it doesn't, and you change the batteries and you turn the flashlight on, and nothing happens, then you have to reject that hypothesis. And you've got to go back and do a couple of things. You probably either have to go back and reformulate your hypothesis, right? Either you've asked the wrong question or you've made the wrong educated guess. Or maybe something's not right in your experimental design, and that isn't working, okay? And you go through it again until you can either accept your hypothesis or not, right? That is the scientific method, right? That governs how we do science, at least in my department in my building, okay? And when you do that with a number of different related investigations, and your hypothesis stands the test of time, then that can develop into a theory, right? So a theory is not a hypothesis. A theory is a broadly conceived, logically coherent statement about something, right? It is, theories are the things of which we are reasonably sure because the science supports them. Does that make sense? Right? And if that theory really stands the test of time and you cannot refute it no matter what you do, that theory may become what we call a general principle, right? Or a law, like gravity. Every time I throw this up, it's probably going to come back down. Because we're pretty certain gravity's real, right? There is a chance that I'll throw it up and it'll go straight through the ceiling and just keep going. But it's such a minute probability that we can say that the law of gravity is what governs the way in which the world works, at least on this time. Does that make sense? That logical hypothesis, series of questions, series of experiments, develop a theory, theory leads to a general principle or a law. And that can be quite controversial, right? So for example, the theory of evolution. Okay. The theory of evolution, when I say controversial, some people say, well, you know, if you're teaching evolution, you've got to teach intelligent design or creationism, and that's a discussion that is, I think, beyond the scope of this class, right? But the theory of evolution is still the general construct that explains a lot about how species evolve over time. Is it perfect? Oh. Does it explain everything? Oh. Does it explain how life started? It does not, right? But it is the theory that has withstood speciation and selective adaptation and so on. Does that make sense? Right? So it's up there and is ready to be supported or falsified. All right. Let me stop there. We'll pick this up and wrap it up with things like uncertainty